We got a couple of very, very interesting reports that are coming out with the Las Vegas Raiders quarterback, Aidan O'Connell. Apparently, the guy's been working out with Tom Brady, which we'll talk about here in a second. Plus, Maxx Crosby's contract details have officially dropped, specifically the cap hits. And as everybody knows, cap hits is always the most important factor. The $35.5 million average value does not matter. Right? What matters is the cap hits, because that tells you how long a team is committed to a player, vice versa, how long a player might be committed to a team. In this case specifically, we're going to get into that in a second, and there's been a lot of updates that have come out with some defensive linemen that have been released. I want to talk a little bit about some of those guys. I'm excited for this one, man. Let's get right into this. So, Mike Dixon, site manager at Vegas Sports Today, recently put this out there. Aidan O'Connell was obviously at some sort of off-season, some sort of event, and in that, Mike Dixon asked him a couple of questions. And one of the questions he asked was about his off-season specifically. And quarterback Aidan O'Connell said that he has added muscle this offseason to boost his performance and durability. He's also been putting in extra work studying film with the Raiders' minority owner Tom Brady at the team facility. To me, that's very, very, very interesting. So apparently, Tom Brady and Aidan O'Connell have been watching tape together. Now, we don't know, is this a one-time thing? Have they studied tape, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times? We don't know, right? But what we do know is Aidan O'Connell has at least studied tape with Tom Brady. And one of the things that people always say with Aidan O'Connell is in terms of the comparison to NFL quarterbacks, Aidan O'Connell is a lot more like Tom Brady than he is someone like Russell Wilson or Lamar Jackson or one of these other quarterbacks. All right, Aidan O'Connell's not the quickest. He does do a good job within the pocket, and generally speaking, has really, really good ball placement. He has one of the best arms in the NFL. I say that all the time. Some people think it's kind of crazy, but Aidan O'Connell can make every throw across the board. Right? The guy has a good arm. The big issue with Aidan O'Connell has been being able to read coverage quickly, recognize coverages, recognize the rotations and those type of things post-snap. And that's been Aidan O'Connell's biggest issue, right? But he is working with Tom Brady. To me, really, really, really love hearing that. Right? Because Tom Brady can help Aidan O'Connell develop, right? He can help him realize that, hey, when I was a quarterback out there and we'd see two safeties deep, but we know there's a chance that these guys are going to rotate from two safeties to one safety. One of the tells for me was always, X, Y, and Z, or whatever it might be. Right? Tom Brady helping Aidan O'Connell understand the quarterback position more could definitely benefit this guy. And of course, we cut Gardner Minshew yesterday, which means our only quarterback that has starting snaps at this point is Aidan O'Connell. And there is a slight chance Aidan O'Connell is going to actually be our quarterback as we go into this next season. That's not guaranteed he's our quarterback because of the fact that they've already targeted Matthew Stafford. There's reports about Sam Darnold and a couple other quarterbacks. I still think the Raiders are going to end up going a different direction at the quarterback position. But I do like the fact that Aidan O'Connell is putting that work in, studying with Tom Brady. And remember, if Sam Darnold wanted to meet up with Tom Brady 4 years ago, he wouldn't have been able to, right? He doesn't have any sort of connection to Tom Brady, right? If another quarterback, Baker Mayfield, wanted to study with Tom Brady, he didn't necessarily have that connection. So Aidan O'Connell has that connection, and he's taking advantage of it. So huge, huge, huge shout out to Aidan O'Connell for that. Now, there's one other thing he does kind of throw in this, and that's that he has added muscle this offseason to boost his performance and durability. To me, the durability part of it is the bigger factor here, right? We know last year Aidan O'Connell had two separate chances to ultimately win over and keep the Las Vegas Raiders job. I should say three technically, I guess, right? Because Aidan O'Connell did have the opportunity in the preseason. He obviously did not win the job. But after Gardner Minshew struggled, right? After whatever week it was, he struggled, looked really, really, really bad. When the Raiders made the switch to Aidan O'Connell, it was his job at that point to lose, right? Like, he could have went out there, dominated, and he would have been the future franchise quarterback for the Raiders. And he looked okay at times, right? But unfortunately, the durability aspect was one of those things that you just can't overlook, right? If a guy takes a hit, if a guy ends up, getting hit, maybe he's not expecting, he gets hit to the head, or maybe it's a hand, or whatever it might end up being. The durability aspect of it is a huge, huge, huge deal, right? Because not only did Aidan O'Connell get hurt the first time that he kind of had that opportunity, but then he got hurt a second time as well, right? After AOC initially had gotten hurt, they went back to Gardner Minshew, and I think at that point, Minshew kind of struggled. And they might have even went to Desmond Ridder. And then at some point, they went back to Aidan O'Connell, and at some point, once again, I believe he got hurt, right? And he missed more time once again. So durability is going to be a big part of Aidan O'Connell. And if he wants to be the Raiders' long-term quarterback, right, he has to be able to prove that he can stay healthy. And truth be told, right, I think if Pete Carroll and John Spytek want to win now, right? If they're 100% invested that we want to win a Super Bowl this year, it's not going to make sense to go with Aidan O'Connell as your quarterback because of the fact that he hasn't shown and he hasn't proven that he's durable, right? You don't get 4 or 5 opportunities to prove yourself. Generally speaking, you get 1, max 2 opportunities. Outside of that, if you can't do it, you're not going to get that opportunity. And I think there's a chance that the Raiders are not, they don't look forward to going into this season without a solid quarterback. And Maxx Crosby's contract is another huge element of that statement right there. There's a chance the Raiders are going to go all in to win a Super Bowl in the next 2 to 3 years. Not only does it make sense from Pete Carroll's contract, right? We all know Pete Carroll's here for 3 years, and then there's a 4th-year team option. Pete Carroll can be here for up to 4 years. And once those 4 years are over, the guy's over 80 years old, right? He might not coach at that point going forward. He might ultimately just end up retiring. What it looks like to me is the Raiders are going to actually go all in, and them targeting Matthew Stafford also kind of makes sense, right? You're trying to go all in, you're trying to get that quarterback. But Maxx Crosby's contract is a whole nother element to this, and we're going to talk about this, man. So if you guys remember, Maxx Crosby's contract, as of 2 days ago, was very, very interesting, right? So in 2025 and 2026, Maxx Crosby had 0 guaranteed money, right? He was not going to get $1 from the Raiders in those 2 seasons, at least guaranteed had the Raiders traded him or cut him. But the Raiders extended him, right, to what they were saying is the highest non-quarterback contract, right? It was a $35.5 million per year contract over 3 years, and that was kind of the extension that the Raiders had kind of thrown in there. Those 3 years were basically for 2027, 2028, and 2029. Now, here's the interesting thing that the Raiders kind of did. So the Raiders actually gave him a bunch of money guaranteed, right? And they actually put all that guaranteed money in 2025 and 2026. And they actually raised the cap hits in those 2 years. And I want you to think about this. Prior to Maxx Crosby signing this contract, his cap hit for 2025 was $27 million. So the Raiders increased his cap hit by $11 million in 2025. In 2026, before the extension, Maxx Crosby's contract in terms of cap hit was $24 million. So once again, they raised it by $11 million in terms of the cap hit. So basically, the Raiders put $11 million more into 2025 and 2026. And that also comes back to the fact that when you do that, right, you're basically saying we're not kind of going all in, but we're going to pay Max, we're going to give it to him up front. And then what that means is the back end of that contract, right, the final 3 years, 2027, 2028, 2029, which are these 3 years starting with that 29 figure down. These 3 years right here are absolutely low as hell, right? If you guys remember, the contract was $35.5 million per year over 2027 to 2029. The cap hits are a lot lower than that 35.5. Think about what the Raiders are essentially doing, right? The Raiders are basically saying, hey, we have cap space this year. We don't have to necessarily give a lot of money out right now. And one of the things we can do is, we can take more of a cap hit this year and next year, right? We're going to increase that by $11 million in each of those 2 years. And then in 2027, 2028, and 2029, it'll be 3 years where Maxx Crosby is going to average, $27.5, $28 million per year. Joey Bosa's making north of $35 million in those 3 years. Myles Garrett will sign a contract close to $40 million in those 3 years. As will Micah Parsons, as will, whichever other defensive lineman end up signing next. Those guys' contracts are going to be north of $35 million. Maxx Crosby's cap hits for 27, 28, 29 is basically going to be $28 million. That's so damn team friendly for the Raiders. I absolutely love the way John Spytek and Pete Carroll designed this contract. That also means that if the Raiders go all in on a quarterback, maybe you sign Sam Darnold to a 2 or 3 year contract. Remember, they tried signing Matthew Stafford to a 2 year contract. If the Raiders sign a quarterback to a 3 year contract, what that means is in those 3 years, right, 27, 28, 29, you can have dead cap hits for that quarterback because Maxx Crosby's contract is going to be a lot less, right? So that's actually very smart by Pete Carroll and John Spytek to be able to kind of design it that way. Now, there's one other thing that I have to mention, and nothing's ever guaranteed in life, right? We don't really know. There was a time when I thought Khalil Mack would never not be with the Las Vegas Raiders. Amari Cooper, although it wasn't the same as Khalil Mack, I always thought, hey, Amari Cooper's one of the best wide receivers. He's probably going to finish his career with the Raiders. And I learned real quick that doesn't always happen, right? You could be a top 5 player at your position. You might end up getting traded, right? And with Maxx Crosby's contract, in the 2 years, the first 2 years or the next 2 years, we're guaranteeing him a lot of money. But in year 3, 4, and 5, he has zero guaranteed money. Maxx Crosby's not going to have anything guaranteed essentially from 2027 to 2029. And here's the thing with that contract. Because of the fact that the cap hits are so low and the Raiders don't have to, aren't guaranteeing Maxx Crosby any dollars in those 3 years, that means the Raiders could actually technically trade Maxx Crosby, or Maxx Crosby could request a trade, which I think is a lot more likely. We have already heard that Maxx Crosby has made it known that if the Raiders don't win now, he might ultimately request a trade, right? Maxx Crosby has made it clear, I'm not going to be in the NFL forever. And Maxx Crosby, who's already 28 years old, will be 30 years old at that point. There's a chance if the Raiders are still, kind of average, if they still kind of continue to suck, there's a chance Maxx Crosby could actually want to be traded. Now, there's a couple of positive things here going in that instance, right? So first and foremost, the Raiders should theoretically be going all in. All right, the Matthew Stafford news, the Maxx Crosby extension, and based off of how the contract kind of looks, to me, the Raiders are trying to go all in, plus Pete Carroll's age, I think also kind of means the Raiders are going to go all in over these next couple of years. So that is positive for the Raiders because we might actually see a Super Bowl for the Raiders in the next 2 to 3 years. I know, it might not happen, but would you be surprised if it does? All right. To me, I think there's a real chance the Raiders will be competing. They might not win it, but they'll be making the playoffs, right? And they're going to push and they're going to try to win over these next 3 years. And if they don't, there's a chance Maxx Crosby requests a trade. And that contract can net us a potential first-round pick, right? Because if the Philadelphia Eagles say, hey, we're potentially, right there, right over the top, the Philadelphia Eagles might say, at 29, 27, $28 million in terms of the cap hit, that makes a lot of sense for us as a football team, right? That's a very, very low cap hit. Again, keep in mind, projecting 3-4 years into the future, those guys can be making $40 million a year, right, in terms of the cap hit. To me, there's a real chance, right? If the Raiders don't win now, Maxx Crosby could request a trade. Now, I would hope that the Raiders are able to kind of figure it out. There's also just that chance that Max just signs another extension at that point as well. But it is interesting nonetheless, and of course, we do have to talk about that being a potential as that time kind of comes. Let's switch focus. Let's talk a little bit about some of the news that's kind of trending in the NFL right now. If the Raiders want to win a Super Bowl, I think the easiest path for us to win right now, of course, we got to get a quarterback. But I think the easiest path for the Raiders right now is to revamp the defensive line. Right, and what I mean by revamping is bring in 1 or 2 pieces that are absolute difference makers. Right, Malcolm Koonce, Adam Butler might end up costing the Raiders $30 million this year. Would it make sense for the Raiders to go in with those 2 guys, or would it make sense to target one of these other guys that might have ultimately become available? Adam Schefter put this out there earlier, saying that the Bengals have taken the rare step of granting All-Pro defensive end Trey Hendrickson permission to seek the trade. It's been an honor and privilege to represent Cincinnati over the last 4 years, said Hendrickson. I love this city and organization. I appreciate the privilege of now being allowed to explore my options. So the Bengals have given permission to Trey Hendrickson to potentially find a trade, right? If you want to go to another team, go ahead and make it work. And remember, the Bengals are making this step because of the fact that they have a bunch of guys under contract, right? They franchise tag T. Higgins. Jamar Chase is one of the highest paid wide receivers. Joe Burrow is one of the highest paid quarterbacks. They have a couple of offensive linemen that are highly paid. That doesn't include some of the other guys on the defensive side, right? They have a highly paid linebacker. They have a highly paid safety, right? So the Bengals have a bunch of guys that are highly paid. So they have to cut some, money somewhere. And I think for the Raiders, I'm not saying Trey Hendrickson has to be the guy for the Raiders, but could you imagine the guy that's led the NFL in sacks and Trey Hendrickson over the past 2 years? Can you imagine that guy on the opposite side of Maxx Crosby? And I'm telling you guys right now, we always say Maxx Crosby's the top 5 pass rusher. Not everybody in the NFL agrees with that, right? There are people that don't actually agree with that. And there's other, some people will say Trey Hendrickson's a top 5 pass rusher, right? That's how good this guy actually is, right? If I'm the Las Vegas Raiders, you have to realistically consider bringing in more defensive linemen, right? If you can build a defensive line unit the way we saw the Philadelphia Eagles have this past season, and remember, the Raiders are close to that. We have Christian Wilkins, who's a top 10 D tackle. We have Maxx Crosby, who's a top 5 D end. You potentially bring in some other guys. Some guys kind of take that next step and develop, right, i.e. Tyree Wilson. And maybe you make a trade for a guy like Trey Hendrickson. I asked Twitter's AI Grok. I went out and I asked him to basically give me a list of all the trades that have impacted defensive ends over the last 10 specifically. And there's some interesting trades in here, right, like in terms of the value. So Montez Sweat went for a second-round pick. I don't think Hendrickson gets as much as Montez Sweat. I don't think he goes for as much. Not that I don't think Hendrickson's a better player. I think Montez Sweat is a lot younger. Hendrickson's older in his career. Plus, the Bears really, really wanted to revamp that defensive line, so it made sense for them to kind of give that up. But you look at some of these other guys. Chase Young's went for a third-round compensatory pick. You look at Matthew Judon. He went for a third-round pick. I think that's a lot closer to what you would potentially get for a guy like Hendrickson. As Darius Smith, fifth and a sixth-round pick, right? It's basically a fifth-round pick for Darius Smith. He's a pretty good defensive lineman as well. Yannick Ngakoue went for a sixth-round pick. Khalil Mack, although this was 3 years ago, did go for a second and a sixth, right? And I think Mack's a good example. Mack may have been a little bit better at that point than Hendrickson. But the Raiders should realistically consider this option where they're potentially trading for a guy like Trey Hendrickson. Now, of course, if you make this trade, right, he's going to want to get paid, right? So that's something you have to factor in right away. You make that trade, he's going to want to get paid. But you could also design the contract in a way where, Maxx Crosby's cap hits in, year 3, 4, and 5 is a lot lower. Maybe you make Hendrickson's cap hits higher in those years, or you just create void years in those 3 years. Maybe you sign him like a 2-year contract, pay him $35 million for each of those years, and just create 3 void years, right? So the cap hits will be a lot lower this year and next year. The Raiders have options. It's not even just Hendrickson. So we've got a couple other things that have kind of come out. So the Chargers released Joey Bosa, who's another really, really good defensive end. I do think Joey Bosa is definitely on the decline. He's not as good as what he once was. He's never healthy. I think it's a huge, huge element as to why the Chargers ultimately released this guy. He's a good football player. He is on the decline. Some people do think he'll be with the 49ers who need defensive line help. People think Joey Bosa will ultimately go and play with his brother, which would be interesting in my opinion. But if you're the Raiders, right, you got to still reach out and you still got to consider it, right? You still got to reach out. You still got to consider bringing Joey Bosa. Bosa says, hey, I haven't been healthy. He's only, I think, 28 years old, so maybe he signs a 2-year contract to kind of prove himself. Maybe it's like $20 million a year over those 2 years. That's probably similar to what you're going to give to Malcolm Koonce anyways. I think for the Raiders, you just got to consider every single option. Now, truth be told, I'd probably take Malcolm Koonce over Joey Bosa, given that Koonce's health should be healthier theoretically. Bowie's missed a lot of time. Koonce has only rather had one injury. Plus, Koonce is a lot younger, right? He's a lot more explosive at this point. But you got to look into Joey Bosa. And I think, the guy that I really, really want from the Las Vegas Raiders is going to be Javon Hargrave. Javon Hargrave was with the Philadelphia Eagles. He signed with the 49ers 2 years back. And after 2 years, the Niners are cutting him. He hasn't really lived up to the hype that he had, especially with the Eagles, right? He's one of the top 10 defensive tackles. He really hasn't been that good for the 49ers. Although I do think, part of that also is like, the media talking. I think when you watch his tape, he's pretty good. But he definitely has not been a top 5 to 7 guy, right? If I'm the Raiders, you have to consider Javon Hargrave. If Adam Butler wants, $10, $12 million a year, if you can get Javon Hargrave for that same amount or even less, right? There's a chance he goes for a lot less because he's older at this point. You got to consider bringing him in, and if not, you got to consider bringing both guys back, right? Imagine Javon Hargrave at let's say $12 million and Adam Butler at $8 million, and let's just say Koonce signs a 1-year contract for $15 million. That's a deadly ass rotation that the Raiders could potentially have right there, right? That doesn't include Tyree Wilson. That doesn't include if you bring back Malcolm Koonce. Of course, in this scenario, you have to bring him back. Even Clavon Chasen. Chasen's going to be a lot cheaper than I think what people realize. To me, that could be a absolute elite defensive line. And I think if you're the Raiders, you have to consider this. You have to go down this path where you're trying to improve that defensive line where, it's unblockable, right? The Eagles were carried by their defensive line 3-4 years ago when they made the Super Bowl and they lost to the Chiefs. They had broken the sack record in that year. And I think, one of the things that kind of neutralized the Eagles was, the field was apparently super slippery. I don't know if you guys remember that in that Super Bowl. And that really slowed down the pass rush, right? And a bad field is always going to impact the pass rushers more than the offensive linemen, right? Because you always got to contain. You can't get you can't grip and, you kind of fall over and those type of things. But even this past season, right, the Eagles were kind of carried by that defensive line. Of course, Saquon Barkley had a phenomenal season. Saquon Barkley carried the offense, but the defense carried it as well, right? They had multiple games where they dominated, right? I think if you're the Raiders, you realistically have to consider bringing in all these different guys that are talented players. Yesterday we brought in Alex Kappa, $5.5 million per year. This doesn't make sense to me, right? I don't think Alex Kappa is the type of guy you start and he's, a superstar caliber guard, right? I don't think he's that type of guy. And if you're going to go out and actually get a quarterback this year, you'd want to have an offensive line that can kind of protect him, right? Of course, unless you go into this season with Aidan O'Connell, he just revamp the entire defense. You bring all these different guys in, and you just try winning on that side of the football, and you just kind of let AOC kind of do his thing. We'll see what ends up happening, right? I want to wrap this video up and just kind of talk about a guy that most of us know really, really well. Hunter Renfrow, former Las Vegas Raiders wide receiver. There's an update that came out that it's really not a big deal, honestly, but it was trending, so I just wanted to kind of talk about it. Former Clemson Tiger and Raiders wide receiver Hunter Renfrow is apparently now working in business development for the recycling industry for the South Carolina Department of Commerce. This is kind of interesting, right? Hunter Renfrow is a pretty good slot wide receiver. I do think that type of player has kind of been removed out of the NFL. I think Hunter Renfrow is kind of the last of that. You don't get a whole lot of guys that are like small and just run short, 5, 6, 7 yard routes. But don't get me wrong, Hunter Renfrow can separate, right? If you got a linebacker on him, he's going to run past these guys. You have a slot corner on him, he's going to create that separation, right? He's a really, really good route runner. The issue with Hunter Renfrow is obviously always the fact that, hey, if he runs, 15-yard dig routes or 30-yard, post routes or whatever, he's on the smaller side. He's not going to out-jump anyone, and he just doesn't have a whole lot of range to his game. But it is interesting, nonetheless, that he has now worked, essentially kind of shifted his career. But I guess it makes sense as well, right? Renfrow's probably like 28, 29 years old. It makes sense for him, right? He has the rest of his life, regardless of the fact that he made millions, got a pretty nice contract with the Raiders. He still has to do something, right? And it makes sense that he's kind of started his career. Although he did say he wants to make a comeback to the NFL. So we'll see what ends up happening for him. Good luck to Hunter Renfrow, man. Always one of my favorite wide receivers that the Raiders have had. Really, really solid person. Let me know what you guys think, man. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time with another video.